Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this Locatee webinar. We'll be on in a few minutes. We'll just allow a bit of time for people to join who have signed up, and then we're going to start right away. Hello again. I'll start with a couple of housekeeping rules. Not really rules, it's more suggestions. We have uploaded the study that we're going to talk about today in the file section, so you can retrieve it from there and read on into the details. And we'd be happy for your questions. You can submit them through the chat. And also you can vote on the questions posted as to what are your priorities in there. We're talking about the current state of corporate real estate in the US. It's been a joint study we as Locatee have done with Verdantix. That's why Dayann Charles is joining me today from somewhere in the UK. Not even sure if you're in central London, but that's where your company is located. And we'll discuss a bit about what we found in the surveys you undertook. And with that said, Dayann, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, perfect, Sabine. So welcome everyone to the webinar today. And like Sabine said, we will be looking at the current state of corporate real estate in the US. My name is Dayann. I'm an industry analyst at Verdantix, part of the smart buildings practice. And just a quick overview of what we do as Verdantix. So we're an independent research and advisory firm. We have 4 practices that revolve around environment, health and safety, ESG, operational excellence, and smart buildings, which is the team I'm in. And for this project, our smart buildings team worked with Locatee to run a study with corporate real estate managers in the US and to tap into the market and see some of the key trends we're seeing emerging from that space around CRE managers, their roles, and in general workspaces. So, as we mentioned, we're here today to dive into some of the findings from that corporate real estate study. And the key message that we derived, or that was derived from the results of the study, was that corporate real estate managers who now have a greater level of influence within their organizations, they need to exploit their greater impact to modernize workplace strategies and move away from assigned workspaces. So what we recommend is moving towards more flexible workspaces, which are more conducive to some of their goals. And we'll break down some of the components and the process we follow to try and get to this message. So here's a quick agenda of what I want to cover today. And before we begin, I'll make sure to outline the demographics of the studies, just so you have some context as to the roles and the individuals that we were quizzing as part of this study. So if we just jump forward a couple of slides. So as part of this study, we spoke with 50 corporate real estate managers at large firms based in the US alone. The majority of our respondents, as you can see on the left, came from very large firms, so firms with over 10,000 global employees. And we ran this study across 5 key industries, as you can see on the right. We spoke to individuals in senior roles that oversaw at least one of either workplace, facilities, or real estate management at their firms. And in most cases, the individuals we spoke to actually covered at least 2, if not all 3 of those areas. The levels of seniority that we targeted for this study were senior managers, vice presidents, heads, directors and senior director positions. So all 50 of the interviews came from one of these hierarchical positions. So we can jump into some of our findings. So the first aspect that we'll jump into is the role of the corporate real estate manager and how that has changed in the last year. So in 2020, we saw that the level of responsibility for CRE managers changed a lot. So most of them saw their responsibilities across operations and strategy increase. And many of them also began collaborating with different business units within their organizational umbrella. Almost every CRE manager saw an increase in at least one of these three areas, so strategy, operations, or collaboration. Which makes CRE managers now one of the, or if not the most well-informed role or position within organizations, because they have oversight and involvement across a lot of the verticals within the business. As you can see at the bottom, more than half of the field actually don't have budgetary sign-off. So only 46% say that they now have final responsibility for budgetary sign-off. So despite the deep level of involvement we're seeing in almost all branches and aspects of the business, more than half of the CRE managers we spoke to are subject to the discretion of someone else when it comes to budgets. And that someone else is almost certainly someone who is less well informed than them because they don't have as broad a reach. On the plus side, the level of influence that they are experiencing is not something they consider to be short-lived. So almost every CRE manager does believe that their increased level of strategic influence is set to stay or rise further in the next 5 years. So this isn't a temporary shift that has occurred in the last year. CRE managers really are an important cog within their organization, particularly around strategy, and they expect to maintain that position for the foreseeable future. So as a whole, this is what's happened to the CRE manager role. So CRE managers have a higher level of influence and a higher level of responsibility that they've attained in the last year. And they very much expect that level of impact to be maintained in the future. But many of them do lack the full budgetary control to make decisions. 62% of the stakeholders, 62% of the CRE managers we spoke to actually mentioned that a lack of stakeholder buy-in is a significant or a very significant challenge to them achieving their business initiatives. So not having the budgetary discretion themselves means that there's an extra obstacle that they have to jump over in order to make decisions. And like I mentioned earlier, those individuals who have that budgetary discretion are most likely individuals who are much less well informed than the CRE managers. CRE managers have a view into a lot of different aspects of the business, and they can make more informed decisions or take measures that are more in line with improving business outcomes. And this may indicate that some within the business hierarchy still wrongly assume that CRE managers are more of a support function, and they play a supporting role in the business rather than what they really are, which is a very influential aspect of the business as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Well, I do see that, of course, corporate real estate follows business missions, but it's really hard to push on certain initiatives. Oftentimes initiatives that really come from the C-suite. If you then have to take that extra loop and get another level of management on board with a new idea who were not in touch with it before and don't understand the implications to 100%. So I think that's actually a point in time where we have the chance to get it right, to equip corporate real estate managers with what they need. And actually, I'd hope that through the time they worked in crisis very closely with other business units like HR and IT, they created some bonds that they can leverage in that, because having worked through that extreme situation, you get to face like how people really, really go about things. So probably you get to that relationship where you are a trusted advisor on certain things and can avoid the situation of sitting in between the shares, and then actually avoid the time-consuming conversations that you need to have to get everyone on board, and then everyone has an opinion, because again, real estate's very, even or especially now with people working from home, very graspable, of having a desk, having an opinion around what to lease, what to do there. And it's just very tedious to have these arguments. And there, I think, an important module, and I think we might tap into that later as well, is to have data backing up these conversations, because you can avoid a lot of the pitfalls if you have that straight from the beginning.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, it is just an extra hurdle, right? So if, as a CRE manager, you're already going through a learning process, understanding kind of all the data and all the outcomes that are occurring in the business, but then you're also having to convey that to someone who is less in tune with that, who may not be part of their responsibility to be informed about all these things, and that just adds that extra level of discretion that can slow things down, that can prevent things from happening, that clearly will improve your business outcomes if you were to implement them yourself. So I think that's really the stumbling block that this puts in place for CRE managers.
It's actually sometimes really disappointing as well if people question you about your processes and how you run projects, that they don't trust you do have the expertise in that area. So that's something that probably with a budgetary sign-off, the responsibility for that from start to end could improve tremendously.
Yeah.
Do we want to move on? I think so.
Yeah. So I think we'll move on. I think we've kind of outlined the changes to the CRE manager role, and we can move on to kind of the approach to workplaces or workspaces that CRE managers are taking. So as you can see from this graph, in the next 2 years, more than 3/4 of CRE managers, so 76% of CRE managers, are implementing a redesign of their workspace. So they're either already undergoing it or they plan to do so in the next 2 years. So this presents really a huge opportunity for CRE managers and businesses as a whole to modernize and rethink their approach to workspaces and how they influence the overall success of a business. Whether firms expand or downsize their overall portfolio, that's a bit more of a mixed bag from our study. We got more scattered results in that realm, but what we do know is that there are changes to the workspace that are upon us. So, like I said, this is a great opportunity for CRE managers to really consider what they're doing with their workspaces and if it's conducive to what they want to achieve as a business. But as you can see on the graph, there is obviously a strong sentiment to change workspaces or redesign workspaces, but the underpinning configurations of workspaces is set to largely remain the same. So you can see that before COVID, so the dark blue bar, 2/3 of firms employed assigned workspace configurations. So that was either cubicles, or open plan spaces, or offices. And in the near future, so the lighter blue bars, there's actually very little shift in that configuration. So overall, there's only a projected 4% increase in the employment of flexible non-assigned workspaces. So the last three categories on the right, hot desking, co-working, and activity-based working, the overall increase in that is only 4%. So although we're seeing a really strong appetite for redesigning workspaces and the opportunity that provides, the actual tangible changes to workspace configurations is very limited. So it's not very drastic at all. And many CRE managers are actually choosing to stick with their assigned workspace configurations. So you can see, I think it's 62% plan to remain with assigned workspaces, either cubicles, open plan, or offices in the next 2 years. So there isn't a huge shift here that translates nicely from the workplace redesign that we're seeing. So we actually asked CRE managers about the factors driving the changes in their workspace configuration in the next 2 years. And the results show that the top two areas, or the top two responses, are maximizing collaboration and innovation and enabling flexibility in your working model. And these are typically more emerging initiatives. So these are not issues that maybe if you were to ask CRE managers 10, 15, 20 years ago, these were probably not high up on the agenda or maybe not considered at all. But you can see now that these two areas are very important to CRE managers when they're choosing workspace configurations, and they trump some of the more traditional factors, such as maximizing workplace productivity, cost efficiencies, and space utilization efficiency. So you can see that there is some emphasis behind collaboration and flexibility here.
Because for me, assigned spaces don't really foster into these two priorities. So I think there's certain layers that need to be unveiled to understand that better. I can imagine that probably changes are not done within a 2 years term because maybe leases are up at that point in time and you don't want to jump on things and consider it properly. But I would have hoped that the change from assigned space to flexible seating would be more tremendously. But maybe we do that study again sometime later, and then we'll find out if that happened.
And I think part of that will be, it's kind of answered here, right? So the next graph you see here is when we queried CRE managers about some of their more traditional, we queried CRE managers about their overall business initiatives, and we saw that here traditional factors came out on top. So they were clearly prioritized over, collaboration and resiliency, satisfaction, and so on, both in the short term and in the long term. So actually, in the long term, you can see some of the cost management and business productivity are increasing wildly, but you can see collaboration, for example, hasn't changed at all in the next 5 years in terms of priority. So this really indicates that kind of disconnect that we've seen over the last two slides. So you can see that there is the priorities of a CRE manager are focused on some of the more traditional aspects, but the reasons driving the changes in workspace configuration are actually a bit more emerging. You're seeing a focus around collaboration and flexibility. So there is that disconnect that we witnessed when we asked these two questions. And when we kind of look into why there is that disconnect and what may be causing this kind of difference in opinion, what we believe is that the influence of the workspace and the workspace configuration is really understated in what is really understated in terms of the impact it can have on business success. So despite the workspace being a really important part of a lot of businesses, where a lot of employees operated and a lot of employees will hopefully in the future also operate and enable them to function, they're often viewed as more of a commodity, part of the furniture as such, rather than an opportunity where more efficiencies can be driven and where business operations and outcomes can be improved. So I think that's the reason why those two graphs seem to show two different sides of a story.
Yeah, I think an important aspect in that is also that for a lot of companies, the success metrics that are in place for corporate real estate, they are still very financially driven. So that's what you get measured by, and then that's what you work towards. So there needs to happen a shift in that, so that the things that you measure actually reflect the priorities that you have, or the strategical aspects of the office that you want to emphasize. Because as long as there is no success metrics in that term in place, what's the incentive to actually do anything there but for the greater purpose if you have that drive yourself?
And we'll see later on that actually it's not a choice of one or the other either. There is a link between focusing on some of these more emerging initiatives while still benefiting or performing better in some of the more traditional outcomes and priorities that businesses have. So you're right that there is at the moment a lot of what's being measured is still focused around some of the more traditional data sets, and having metrics in place to measure some of these new areas and aligning that with your priorities will help CRE managers and businesses focus themselves in the right area.
Yeah.
So I think we kind of covered, the approach to workspaces, and I guess the question now is, how can CRE managers overcome this disconnect? And there are two kind of parts to this and jumping on the opportunity that this presents. So one of them is consolidating and aligning priorities, and the other is moving towards non-assigned workspaces, which are more flexible. And we will look into both of these over the next few slides. So there's a lot on this slide to unpack, but I think it's really important for people's sort of contextual understanding. And it really shows how flexible workspaces or non-assigned workspaces are more conducive to business goals in general. So just to clarify, on the left, you have all the aggregated responses from our participants, so all 50 participants, on how effective their workspaces were in achieving some of the various targets you see on the y-axis. And this includes responses from both assigned workspaces and non-assigned workspaces. And then on the right, you have a subset of this data with responses from only those participants who used or who were employing non-assigned workspaces. So to begin with, I've highlighted two factors, so maximizing collaboration and innovation and enabling flexibility in your workspace. So if you remember back, these were the two factors that were considered or that were cited as the most influential factors for driving workspace configuration in the next 2 years. And you can see that for both factors, the results for non-assigned workspaces were much more effective than the average across all workspaces. So you can see that 53% believe that maximizing collaboration and enabling flexibility, non-assigned workspaces were effective in those two very effective in those two areas, whereas only 38% and 30% respectively felt that on the whole. So in reality, actually, because the left graph is an average, assigned workspaces actually had a much lower percentage than even what's shown there. And in our study, another data point we were able to collect is that 72% of respondents considered inflexible systems and building design as a significant or very significant challenge to them meeting their objectives. So you can see why it's important to really enable flexibility in your working model and in your workplace configurations as well. But those two factors that I've highlighted are some of those more contemporary factors. If we look at some of the more traditional factors or the more conventional factors, which topped business initiatives for CRE managers overall, we can see some advantages for non-assigned workspaces here as well. So non-assigned workspaces were actually considered more effective in achieving cost efficiencies and space utilization efficiency than assigned workspaces. So those were two of the three top priorities that we highlighted earlier for CRE managers. So what this really shows is that not only can non-assigned workspaces better serve the factors which are driving workspace configuration in the next 2 years, so collaboration, flexibility, some of those more emerging factors, but they can also produce better outcomes for some of the key business priorities for CRE managers. And this will link into what you said, Sabine, about data, right? There is a linkage between, you can focus on some of these more emerging areas, and as a consequence of that, as a benefit of that, you can also improve your performance and your outcomes in some of the more traditional areas. So it's a better way to kind of tackle all the areas you want to tackle as a business, and perhaps improve your vision and your brand, for example. So if we jump to the next one, we can see that CRE managers are actually aware of the demands of the office and how they are changing over the next 5 years. So 86% of respondents actually agree that workspaces will be champions of brand and culture in the future. And 88% believe that comfort and satisfaction will trump density of users when we consider space efficiency. So there is an understanding from CRE managers that the purpose of the office is actually changing. And if we move on, we can see kind of more broadly speaking, 2/3 of CRE managers agree that assigned workspaces will be effective in achieving business goals. So I'll just wait for the slide to change. There you go. So you can see here that 2/3 on the left, you can see that 2/3 of CRE managers agree that assigned workspaces will be ineffective in achieving business goals. But 60% on the right do believe that offices will still play a part in their businesses. But what this really highlights is that if there is a lack of action and CRE managers continue to depend on assigned workspaces and assigned workspace configurations, This will leave businesses with workspaces that are really ineffective at achieving their goals, and risks making those spaces sort of completely redundant, and they become expensive assets within the portfolio of a business that don't really drive any value. And we know from the long lease or typically long lease contracts that you might be stuck with those sort of assets for a while, and they'll just be draining value. So CRE managers who, as we said, most of them are undergoing redesigns. Most of them that want to stick to their assigned workspaces need to kind of consolidate their beliefs that they've shown here, and apply it to the actions that they are putting in place. So they actually need to pursue non-assigned workspaces, because they have an understanding that assigned workspaces will not be effective in the future. And in order to try and keep the office value in place, they need to be able to move towards non-assigned workspaces that are better for their goals.
Yeah, I have to say, when I saw these results, my faith in corporate real estate was restored. That people are believing in the office as a destination, but also in providing more flexible workplaces for staff. And I have to say, I do understand that it's not an easy undertaking to go from the one model to the other if you've been in that certain workplace setting for a long time, because that's what people are used to, and change is always different and needs to be accompanied and modeled by senior management as well. So that's not something that you do overnight, especially not in these uncertain times where you really don't know, when are we going back to the office? How many people are going back to the office? Will be allowed to the office? And then leases running, as I've mentioned that before, the lease is running up. Should we do anything at all, or just stick it out here and wait for the next location and do it better there? Or another idea would be pilot there now, and then for the next location. So I mean, there's different routes that you can take, and it's not always easy to pin down what's the best way to move that forward, again, because politics play a part as well, and you need to convince a lot of stakeholders of that model. So it's oftentimes not as easy as it seems from the outside.
And I think that harks back to your point, and we'll touch upon this sort of at the end of this webinar around data, right? It's really hard to kind of pinpoint, like you said. If I were to, as a business, if we were to open up and allow people to work flexibly, it's difficult to understand what people want to do, how many days they want to work in the office, how long, what spaces they need, right? But that's where the technology can come in and help, right? If you have occupancy data that can help you understand, how many people are in an office, what are the patterns for usage, and that can help you make some of those redesign decisions. And even in some cases, it might be really beneficial in helping you, downsize your real estate portfolio. You might be able to keep the same level of efficiency or improved efficiency with a smaller real estate portfolio, because now you understand that a certain number of people will always be working at home. You always have people that want to work in both locations, and then there's a balancing act that needs to be done, and that's very difficult. It's very difficult at this point in time to judge that, and that's, as I said, we'll talk about it later, is where the data can come in, because it's very easy even now. CRE managers might say, look, we're running surveys and we know what employees want, but the likelihood of that being the same sentiment that they have in the future is very low. If you ask me now, how many days I want to go into the office, it might be one answer. But if the vaccine's rolled out and I suddenly enjoy being back in the office, or I completely hate being back in the office, then my answer might change in the future. And that's where the technology can help you keep kind of a real-time view into how your spaces are being used, what the demands are, and then it can keep you as a company more flexible to the demands of your employees and the demands of your business as well. So we'll touch upon that in a short while as well.
It's exactly that. You can start now with the assumptions, with scenario modeling, with thinking about, okay, how many people will take up the offer of remote work going forward? How much time of their day will they, or of their days in the week, will they be remote or in the office? And then see how that would factor in on real estate demand. But then you have to have later on the metrics in place to verify that, to make sure your assumptions are correct. Yeah, but that's, as you said, it's going to be a long journey to get there.
So I think this slide is quite a nice consolidation of one of the key messages we're trying to portray here. So it really is kind of time to take advantage of the clear benefits that non-assigned workspaces offer. And CRE managers can really do this by consolidating their understanding of the future of workspaces, which we saw in the last couple of slides, with with their overall business priorities and the drivers of their office redesigns. So they should reorder their priorities, their overall business priorities, to focus on improving more contemporary, more emerging initiatives such as collaboration and business flexibility. And they should do this by using non-assigned workspaces, which better reflect their long-term beliefs around how effective offices will be in the future. And then this can help improve both emerging areas of business priority, as well as some of the traditional areas, such as achieving cost efficiency and achieving space utilization efficiency as well. So it really allows, by kind of having some synergy here, it really allows CRE managers to kill two birds with one stone and tackle the different areas of their role in a better manner. And that's why this consolidation is really important, and the focus on non-assigned workspaces will really help generate that value in reality. So I think if we look at the next couple of graphs, you can see that, and we touched upon this earlier, that most of the data coverage, as seen on the left, is still in traditional business metrics. So you can see their space utilization and operating costs are almost covered by every respondent that we spoke to. But CRE managers are beginning to roll out technologies to support some of the more emerging initiatives. So by the end of 2021, at least 60% of firms expect to have technologies such as employee engagement tools, workplace services solutions, and space monitoring tools in place. And some of that number is made up by firms that already have it in place. And another data point that isn't shown here, but 84% of corporate real estate managers also expect to have, 84% of corporate real estate managers expect to have home working collaboration tools in place as well, which will help build flexibility into their business. I actually think that is on the graph. Just to make sure. So there are signs that from a technology standpoint, CRE managers are kind of delving into this area, trying to get a better understanding and a context, sort of a contextual understanding of what they require. And like I mentioned, these technologies can really help firms understand what the changing requirements are going forward, and better plan and inform their decisions. And if in some cases where they might have some extra hurdles of having to convince other people, the data can always help persuade people by demonstrating, what are the real-time statistics that highlight the business case for certain technologies or for certain decisions as well.
When faced with crisis, you're tempted to find the quick fix to things. Because you want to have that problem squared away, because that's what not makes you sleep at night. But I think, especially looking forward, of wanting to build the data sets to be able to verify utilization and adoption of the workplace again, and all these kind of things, that you don't run for short-term solutions only exclusively, but keep in mind what you want to do in the mid and the long term, because I've seen it happen more than once. If you get the short-term solution, it might stick, and then you always have to fiddle with it and try to integrate it with other things as well. So that's something that I'd say you'd need to be mindful in that regards of.
Yeah, and like I said, the situations can change. I know this is a slightly kind of different area, but last year when we covered a lot of kind of COVID technologies in the workspace, one of the things we saw is a lot of focus and a lot of investment around thermal screening cameras. This was when people were very desperate to get employees back in the office, and it wasn't something that we advocated for strongly, because there are very few use cases in the future for thermal screening cameras, and it was very much a quick win solution, right? Trying to get people back in the offices with no real long-term value. Particularly in Europe, once the laws became stricter and kind of reverted to the norm, those technologies are no longer useful or no longer applicable. You can't use them legally to measure people's temperatures, and therefore there's no real long-term value in investing like that. So like you say, it's very important to have or to make decisions in an informed manner and make sure that you're not making them to kind of solve a problem quickly. And I think that's where, like I mentioned, space monitoring, utilization tools can come into play. Employee engagement tools can come into play because there is long-term value. They can fix an issue or support an issue right now. Understanding how employees feel about coming back to the office, understanding how people are using the office, and then going forward, they can support office redesign plans. They can support employee communication channels. And they can be scaled out to different buildings and used across buildings. So I think that's an area where it's really important that people don't make quick decisions. And I think perhaps we're past the time now that people, if they're making quick decisions, most people might have already made them. But it's still important to make sure that your decisions have a view into the future of what other technologies you might want to incorporate. Do you plan to expand your buildings, and is your solution only set for one building? Because then you might have a patchwork of systems across different buildings. And if I'm an employee that has a home base and then sometimes I have to work in an office in a different state, does a system, does my employee engagement system change, and then I have to get a new app and then it's not as clear, and so on. So it's really important to have that long-term focus with all your decisions.
Yeah, and I just read we have a question, and that fits really well, so I'm going to ask it now. But I encourage you in the meantime in the audience to post additional questions if you have them. It is the thermal cameras was really interesting, that bit. Could you think of something else that might be a short-term solution that might not feel so obvious as a good fit? Otherwise, I might have one.
I think you can go first. I'll give it a.
Okay, I'll do that. Because I see a lot of people, I see a lot of organizations investing in desk booking tools. I'm not saying that's completely off or wrong, but I think, again, this is maybe not completely a long-term solution, because what happens with desk booking is most likely what happens with meeting room bookings. Those desks will go unattended. You'll have no-shows, and then resources are booked and not used, which creates another issue that companies have seen a long time happening with meeting rooms. And I see other organizations, or also in our customer base, who have solved that problem for the time being just with simple rules of who can be there when, having an Excel list. I know that's for bigger corporations tedious, but if the desk booking tool might not solve the solution completely, then it will be useless in a couple of years.
I think maybe in a slightly broader focus, one of the things that can be, a short-term solution is really focusing on a point solution and not understanding that there might be, broader solutions that can play into that. So, you might invest in a touchless elevator control system, for example, but there are also solutions that kind of provide a touchless experience all the way through, so that incorporate or integrate sort of access control, desk booking, food ordering, and so on. So if you've kind of forked out for an expensive point solution in elevator control, and then you want to sort of implement sort of touchless controls across your building, you end up having two systems where one thing can cover everything, but because you've paid for something else, you're having to use both, or you end up not getting the larger system. So I think that's not necessarily that touchless elevator controls are a waste of money or anything, but it's just that there is an element of how does it fit into kind of my technology ecosystem. Similar to what you said around desk booking, right? You want something that can help integrate all these factors. So if a desk goes unused, then you want a system that can allow you to highlight that to people, highlight that to management, or make that space available on digital screens, for example, and connect that experience together. So I think there is an element of trying to thinking a bit more broadly to try and connect the technologies you put in place to help build a more seamless experience.
Yeah, and then with the touchless elevators, you might not own the building, and then it might be a multi-tenant building as well. Do you want to invest in that? You probably try to convince your landlord to do it, but you yourself wouldn't, and then you couldn't actually provide the same experience to all your employees, which is kind of not really helping inclusion as well. So yeah, there's again certain layers that you can have a look at. But let's move ahead.
Yeah, so I think the kind of last stage of what we want to cover is what are the high level steps to take to approach this new challenge around workspaces and really drive business value through taking these steps and drive value from the workspaces you have. So firstly, as we mentioned, control around budgetary decisions must be handed over to CRE managers. So they already have that kind of elevated level of strategic and operational influence, and they work across different areas of the business. And as we highlighted, a lot of them have started collaborating with many verticals within the business, such as HR and IT. So they're really well informed and really well placed to make those investment decisions. Whether it's what technologies they should invest in or how to redesign workspaces and even picking real estate. So I think the first step we would recommend and highly recommend is really handing over the keys of budgetary discretion to CRE managers and removing one of the key hurdles there are to kind of improving business outcomes that we've seen. I think then the second step is for CRE managers themselves to change their mindset. So rather than focusing on primarily the traditional metrics of business, such as sort of productivity, they should focus more on some of the more emerging factors, such as maximizing collaboration, improving employee satisfaction, and enabling greater flexibility. And improvements in these areas, like we mentioned, they can in turn lead to better performance in some of the traditional areas as well. So one interesting data point that I've seen is that in a 2018 study by Gallup in the US, they found that more engaged workers were shown to be 21% more profitable than disengaged workers. So that shows a clear link where by having a happier, more engaged workforce, improving their employee satisfaction, you're able to drive more benefits for the business as a whole. So you get more success at that point. So improving satisfaction is a key avenue for that, and focusing business initiatives on more the broader emerging themes can help CRE managers align themselves with some of their long-term beliefs for what workspaces will be in the future. So if you remember, they said, there'll be champions of brand and culture, and space utilization efficiency will be less about kind of density of users in the future as well. And then I think the final step is the most significant step, and perhaps the most difficult, but it is kind of a natural progression from the first two steps here. And it will really allow firms to reap the benefits of these first two steps. So businesses and CRE managers who have their kind of newfound influence and hopefully their budgetary discretion at this point as well, they should pursue changes to workspaces that focus on establishing kind of a set of flexible workspace configurations. So it's important that firms employ workspaces that are flexible to achieve those new initiatives or those new business initiatives that they're focusing on, but also performing effectively in some of those more traditional priorities. And moving to non-assigned workspaces will also de-risk the chance of offices becoming redundant or diluting the value of offices. And it will maximize the opportunity to succeed in achieving more kind of collaboration and flexibility, and including more resiliency within the business. So hopefully, we don't come to a situation where we have to go through another pandemic, but other events do occur in a more localized level, and having more flexibility in a business can help, and having more flexibility through non-assigned workspaces can help firms kind of navigate that with less business disruption and more business continuity. And one of the things that maybe we haven't touched upon too much, but is really important to consider, is from an end user perspective, right? In attracting kind of employees back to the office, they need a reason to kind of go back, and kind of an inflexible assigned workspace is kind of a poor replica of what people have at home, right? So they need a they need an office that offers flexible spaces for a range of different activities that they might need to do, and have that available through technologies that allow for easy access. And these technologies will help kind of improve the presenteeism of employees in the office at a time where a lot of workforces may question why we should be in the office at all. Actually, one of the data points we had during our study is that 78% of respondents thought that increased employee desire for home or flexible working would be a significant or very significant challenge to their initiatives. So it's really important that we don't make offices worse or keep offices in the same kind of space. We really make them more appealing for employees and more conducive to the activities they want to complete. So, having different types of spaces in the workspace will help them drive more value than if they're just staying at home and they just have another office space, for example.
And thank you, Dayann.
Yeah.
I think with that, we're at the questions section, and there are a couple that are really interesting. I'm going to start with this one. How do you go about advocating for change in the company? I can take that one. Because what we say is all very nice, but how do you make it happen? How do you go for that budget sign off and things? And what, from my experience, helps a lot is to have evidence of why that will be beneficial to the company. To really, again, draw on data, maybe even have a track of like, that's how many conversations I need to lead to get to a decision. That's how much time I spend on this, preparing slides for different stakeholders, going through it with them again and again. And then also for a lot of solutions, there will be as well financial benefits for the company. Again, if you think about assigned workspaces, you will probably have to prove the return of invest of doing things like that. And that again might have different layers. Because it will have impact on employee experience and well-being as well, that you might not grasp that immediately. But then again, that's something that you could partner up with your HR department on. So it's basically about building the case, getting the evidence in place to be convincing that this needs to be done, and maybe also talk to peers who have that organizational background, who do have budgetary sign-off, and get them to tell how it works differently for them and what the advantages and disadvantages are, being very transparent about it. Because if you're not, it's going to come back and, excuse my language, bite you in the arse. Do you want to add something, Dayann, or should I chip in?
No, I think you covered kind of all the areas I wanted to cover quite succinctly.
Good. So then I have an interesting question as well, actually tapping into what I just said a little bit. At what point does corporate real estate speak with human resources?
I think we can both kind of cover this. I think corporate real estate, like we mentioned, we've seen a lot more collaboration with HR, and it becomes a part of, by making your workspace more connected, you also want to make your kind of business units more connected as well. And human resources will really help with that first stage of understanding, and they'll help throughout, but they'll particularly at the first stage of understanding what the demands of the office are in the future. So whilst you're going through that redesign process, you might be asking questions like, how much collaborative space do we need? How much individual space do we need? How many conference rooms do we need? And so on and so forth. And human resources can really help with that aspect of it, because they can get a view into, through employee engagement surveys or employee engagement tools, they can get a view into how many people want to be in the office. I know for Verdantix ourselves, our human resources department is what is running all the, is the business unit that's running all the kind of back to work metrics and surveys, so that they can understand how much of the office needs to be used, what the demands will be. So I think it's not a case of what point human resources will be involved. I think human resources are just a key part of all the decisions going forward. And it's really what we've highlighted here is that the CRE manager, the importance of their position is really highlighted by this question, because they already have a direct link with these guys. They're already collaborating with this unit, but they're also collaborating with IT. They're already speaking with hierarchy. so by being kind of interconnected to all these different business units at sort of all times, they can get a better understanding of what is needed and kind of relay the messages and the key decisions across the business as required. And wherever they feel the need to include human resources, particularly around employee engagement and employee kind of sentiment, is where I'd highlight. They can always speak to human resources in more depth at that point and work a little bit more closely than normal.
Yeah. When I read the question, I wanted to say, like, ideally all the time. I know that's not realistic, but I do see the three top areas where they need to be involved. That is like defining what employee experience should look like, because they know the talents that they recruit best. And then putting into place the measures to make sure the workspace actually caters to that, to make that actually readable and measurable from data, because only if you measure, you can act upon it. And then that's where they can tap into employee surveys in these kind of things. And then the third very important area is as well headcount numbers, anticipated growth, because that's what you need to right size locations.
And I think you touch upon a really important point there, which is, and we've seen this with some of our other work as well, is that HR can really help with what we call building personas, user personas in the office, right?
Yeah.
Really about understanding, it's not just about, partly it is about how many people will come into the office, but it's also about understanding, what job roles in the organization can work from home, what job roles have to be in the office, or what job roles can work in both locations. So it's about building those assumptions to begin with, and then kind of feeding in that data through feedback to kind of cater and kind of refine the model of what you need from the office. And HR is really important in helping build those user personas and really in communicating with employees and kind of getting that information to understand, there are this many people in the office. We see this kind of peak in office demand in this location, and they want these kind of spaces. So how do we tackle that? And they can really help with building those personas and understanding. And then those personas, from what we've seen, is really one of the key drivers of the redesign, right? So if you know a lot of your work is collaborative, you will have a lot more focus on collaborative spaces. But you might be in a company that has quite a lot of data scientists who need the individual space, but also do want to come into the office. And therefore, you need to design your office spaces to be able to equip that, to be able to kind of acknowledge that. And that even goes down to things like the canteen, for example. There may be a lot of job roles that are very collaborative, that people have meetings in the canteen. There might be an opportunity to have that, and you might design your canteen around that. So there are loads of different elements that, by having HR looped in, it can help you build those personas and understand what you really need from your spaces.
Yeah. Nothing to add to that. Now, a question that brings us back a bit more in the corporate real estate realm is, are there any less traditional data sets you've seen? Sorry, my vision gets worse. It's turning into night. You've seen CRE managers used to achieve their goals.
So I think the kind of key areas we've mainly touched upon, occupancy data. Sometimes that occupancy data can be collected rather than putting in new sensors. You might have security control and access control systems in place, and that could be an easy way to just have an underlying number of how many people are in the office. But we're also seeing we're seeing data into how spaces are actually being used and how many people are in a conference room and so on. The other area is employee engagement, having surveys about how they feel about the workplace, how they want to be back. I think that's maybe an area where, I don't know if it's kind of less traditional, but it's definitely something that maybe 2 years ago wasn't considered as much, right? Now it's really about understanding what and convincing people to come back to the office. There's a reason to come back to the office, and for that to be the case, you really need to understand. You can have kind of as nice an office as possible, but if there's no reason for an employee to come into the office, then why would they come in? So I think we're seeing a lot more focus around employee sentiment as well, which might not always be quantitative but more qualitative than before.
Yeah, that's why I think that typically it's helpful to put that data together, to have the qualitative feedback, but always reference it with quantitative data as well to build that narrative. Because I think one without the other oftentimes doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, and that's really why having the CRE manager, having these or being able to make these decisions is important, right? Because they have their kind of hand in every pot. They're working with IT, they're working with HR, they're working with hierarchy, so they have a view into kind of all these areas. The IT department may not know really how many people want to work in the office, and the HR department might not know the kind of technology strain there is in having a certain number of people. They might think, okay, look, we have everyone in the office. We're ready to go. We're ready to open up the office and allow everyone back in to work in a flexible manner. And the IT department might understand that we actually don't have the infrastructure in place yet to have flexible spaces. So one kind of simple example of that is you might have a lot of sort of hot desking or open spaces where you can kind of book or you can go in and use them. And each room might have a projector or a second screen. But if your company is filled with employees that have both Macs and Windows devices, you might not be able to connect into each of those projectors or those screens in each of those rooms. So that in turn means that I can't use every room with my laptop, and therefore half the rooms are no longer available to me. So there's that level of understanding that you can get by connecting all those data sets. You can't get individually. The IT team will be able to tell you that, look, we have 50% of employees with Apple products. They won't be able to connect into these monitors. We might need a shift or a revamp of what our technology is that we have in place, and that will help kind of make that experience a lot more seamless.
Yeah. So there is another question, and I think that's probably a good one to close us out. It is, what needs to be done to follow through on business priorities? And I think that's a very stringent process, actually. You start at looking at what do these business priorities mean? Why are they in place? What does it mean for the business? Which initiatives are in place there? And then you start thinking about, okay, how can corporate real estate support that? What are the value drivers that corporate real estate can tap into, identifying that? And then I'm coming back to the data, is putting the performance measures in place to follow up if that goal was really achieved. And if need be, putting the tools and processes in place to actually do that. Now, that was probably really, really simplified. Dayann, do you have a view on it?
Yeah, I'll mostly agree. I think the one thing is that, and I hope it's been clear, but I just want to reiterate that it's very much it's not one or the other, right? You don't have to succeed in traditional business priorities at the expense of some of the more emerging priorities. What we're suggesting is if you kind of focus more on those emerging priorities, in turn you'll be able to benefit in or have better outcomes in more of the traditional priorities. And like Sabine said, having a focus on that data and having that data in place to both inform your decisions, but also verify what's happening, that will really help to kind of make sure there's like a successful loop where you take an action, you see the results, you adjust accordingly, and you sort of perpetually improve as a business in kind of across the board in terms of your priorities.
Yeah. With that said, I think all questions were answered, at least the ones in the chat. If there's more, we've put our contact details here. We're happy to connect and continue the conversation. Let me say thank you, Dayann, for shedding light into the details of our survey. It was a pleasure to talk to you. And for the audience, wherever you are, what time of the day it may be, I hope you have a good evening or afternoon or morning. And thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you for listening.